The first slide is going to be a slight shock to people who are expecting entirely the 18th and 19th century, but we will go back immediately to the 19th century. I promise you, she's rather more contemporary, but she will disappear very quickly. As recently as May 2018, the then Prime Minister Theresa May told a glittering Conservative dinner at Tate Britain that conservatism across Europe was inspired, conservatives across Europe were inspired by Burke and the great figures of our history who continue to speak to us today. Those great figures of the 19th century Conservative Party themselves had been inspired by Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, published in November 1790. He was Peel's favorite author, and the young Disraeli did little more than rehash him with his own literary gloss. Burke's famous book had itself been a conservative and condemnatory response to the ideas behind the French Revolution of 1789. It was a revolution that claimed to be based on the two concepts of natural rights and the sovereignty of the people. Together, they challenged the legitimacy of governments throughout Europe, which were based on tradition, custom, heredity, and hierarchy. Edmund Burke was the son of a Dublin lawyer. He graduated from Trinity College, Dublin, and came to England to train for the bar at Middle Temple. He was a member of Parliament from 1765 until 1794. He took an active part in the political issues of his time. He was a Whig, attacking crown privilege, asserting parliamentary rights, sympathizing with the American colonists, and opposing the penal laws in Ireland. He never wrote a systematic work on political philosophy. His pamphlets, speeches, letters, and tracts demonstrate a profound concern for contemporary issues and a mind moving from one political controversy and conflict to another. The foundation of Burke's political outlook lay in his convictions about religion and morality. The principles of true politics are those of morality enlarged. These principles molded into the nature and essence of things. For Burke, commonwealths are not physical, but moral essences. Religion is the vital principle of the physical, the moral, the political. Well, burning up a bit. Thank you. He believed in order because God was its author and the universe reflected it. We have someone from Kazakhstan joining us as well. Very late there, by the way. Good order is the foundation of all things. Burke viewed society as a contract and the state as a partnership. It was the nature of a contract that there is no part existing of force to alter it without a breach in the covenant and the consent of all parties. It was a partnership, and the goal of which could only be obtained by many generations. But it was but a clause in the great primeval contract in which each is in their appointed place. The social compact was thus permanent, binding, and unchangeable. It supposes the discussion made and the dispute settled. Burke maintained that there was a manifest and marked distinction between change and reform, between change on one side and reform or reformation. Change is novelty, yet, rather confusingly, to innovate is not to change, because change cannot be certainly known beforehand. Burke used the language of Aristotelian metaphysics to explain the total consequence of fundamental change. Change not only affected the outward visible appearance, but also the very essence of a thing. It alters the substance of the objects themselves and gets rid of all their essential good, as well as of all the accidental evil and next to them. In modern jargon, it throws the baby out with the bathwater. Reform was essentially a matter of tackling abuse and was therefore beneficial if its intention was healing and mediatorial. Its purpose is friendly and its scope moderate. Hence, Burke upheld that the wisdom of a timely reform is against the more drastic measures advocated when reform is overdue. Early reformations are amiable arrangements with a friend in power. Late reformations, apologies for the asterisk, late reformations terms imposed on a conquered enemy. Early reformations are made in cold blood. Later reformations are made under a state of inflammation. Both the interests of government and of the people are served by early reformations because a temperate reform is permanent and because it has a principle of growth. Reform must be gradual and moderate. There was a limited scope for moderate change in the interests of conserving the essentials. A state without the means of some change is without the means of its own conservation. Even his revered British Constitution admitted innumerable improvements, correcting the original scheme and removing corruptions and abuses. The country has ever been bettered by such a revision. The distinction between moderate change, allowing temperate reform on the one hand, and avoiding the drastic consequences of unchecked change on the other, was clearly demonstrated in the contrast between the character of the British Constitution and that of the French Revolution. I think I've gone too far, actually. Sorry, that comes up. Sorry, too fast. The purpose of reform is to conserve and to extend the concrete advantages which a society has produced in the course of its historical development. To wipe the slate clean and to destroy the labors of ages in the hope of realizing an ideal order of society is not reform, but criminal folly. The French revolutionists complained of everything. They refused to reform anything. They left nothing at all unchanged. Where these men had gone wrong, in Burke's opinion, was not realizing a middle path between two extremes. Here Burke draws on the wisdom of Aristotle. There is something else than the mere alternative of absolute destruction or unreformed existence. A disposition to conserve and an ability to improve, taken together, would be my standard of a statesman. But believe that politicians dealt with the actual condition of society. It is man in the concrete. It is with common human life and human actions you are to be concerned. He was therefore dismissive of abstract ideas and condemned the whole notion of natural rights as meaningless and dangerous delusion. What is the use of discussing a man's abstract right to food or medicine? The question is upon the method of procuring and administering them. In that deliberation, I shall always advise to call in the aid of the farmer and the physician, rather than the professor of metaphysics. The doctrine of natural rights rested on mere speculation. They cannot be proved from experience. They have no legal or historical basis. There is no concrete evidence that they actually exist. The only rights which do exist, according to Burke, do derive from a fundamental natural, not from a fundamental natural right, but from the inheritance of the past. Burke based his case not on abstract right, but on prescription and prescriptive right, by which he meant that the liberties and rights of Englishmen, and incidentally, though he was Irish, he referred to himself as an Englishman, derived from ancient custom, stemming from time immemorial, from history, tradition, custom, and precedent. That gave them their authority and their authorization. Here are a few extracts. Maybe if you can read that yourselves, that might be help for a moment. I'll read it if I can. Okay, you will observe from that Magna Charta to the Declaration of Rights. It has been the uniform policy of our Constitution to claim and to assert our liberties as an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers and to be transmitted to our posterity as an estate specially belonging to the people of this kingdom, without any reference whatever to any other general or prior right. By this means, our Constitution preserves a unity in so great a diversity of its parts. We have an inheritable crown, an inheritable peerage, a House of Commons, and the people inheriting privileges, franchises, and liberties from a long line of ancestors. Prescription is the most solid of all titles, not only to property, but which is to secure that property to government. It is accompanied with another ground of authority in the human mind, presumption. It is presumption in favor of any settled scheme of government against any untried project that a nation has long existed and flourished under it. They have the rights of men. Against these, there are no prescription. There can be no prescription. Against these, no argument is binding. They admit no temperament and no compromise. Anything withheld from their full demand is so much of fraud and injustice. Against these rights of men, let no government look for security in the length of its continuance, or in the justice and leniency of its administration. These metaphysical rights are all extremes. Government is not made by virtue of natural rights. The moment you abate anything from the full rights of men, each to govern himself, and suffer any artificial positive limitation upon these rights, at that moment the whole organization of government becomes a convenience. Edmund Burke is seen as the founding father of modern conservatism, not only because of his condemnation of abstract principles and attachment to historical tradition, but also because of his emphasis on duties and obligations which exist alongside rights and duties and liberties. Duties are not voluntary, they arise from the relation of man to God, which relations are not matters of choice. Edmund Burke was a Whig and remained so for the whole of his life. Reflections included his stalwart defense of the principles of the 1688 revolution as he understood them, under the Whig doctrine of a mixed and balanced constitution. The origins of the division between Whigs and Tories lay in the exclusion crisis of the 1870s. Incidentally, I should point out to those of you who are not aware of this, the term the Tory party, as I'll try and explain this in a moment, the Tories party became, in its second incarnation, as I'll explain, eventually the Conservative Party, or their leaders, some leaders preferred still to this date to refer to themselves as Tories rather than Conservatives. And we'll see that between Peel on one side and Disraeli, for example, on the other shortly. At issue was the right of the Roman Catholic younger brother of Charles II to succeed him to the throne as James II. The Whigs wanted to exclude him on the grounds of his religion, while Tories believed that he had the divine right to succeed Charles irrespective of his religion. The word Tory had already come into the English language as an Irish noun, from an Irish noun meaning outlaw or highwayman, itself derivative of the Irish verb to pursue. The constitutional crisis over the so-called Glorious Revolution divided the Tories between those who accepted the revolution with the accession of William and Mary, and those who continued to uphold the right of James II and his successors to the throne, between revolution Tories and Jacobites. Ultimately, that division proved fatal to the old Tory party, especially after the accession of the Hanoverian George I in 1714. The political designation of Tory faded out of general usage by the middle of the 18th century. Among Burke's friends was James Boswell and Dr. Samuel Johnson. Boswell, who was Johnson's traveling companion and later biographer, recorded that on one occasion with him, "We were all well entertained and very happy at Dr. Knowles, where was a very agreeable company, and we drank Church and King after dinner with true Tory cordiality." Dr. Johnson was unquestionably a Tory. In the 1773 edition of his dictionary, he defined Tory as one who adheres to the ancient constitution of the state and the apostolical hierarchy of the Church of England, opposed to a Whig. Anti-Jacobin conservative reaction was in the ascendant for virtually half a century, from the appointment of William Pitt the Younger in 1783 to the fall of Wellington in 1830. In the wake of the French Revolution, moderate political and constitutional reform was shelved, repressive measures introduced and enforced. Pitt the Younger rigorously conducted the war against, firstly, revolutionary France, and latterly against Napoleon Bonaparte. In the pursuit of that primary aim, his government clamped down on all forms of radical activity and legislated against any organizations which it deemed to be subversive. This, which I think is by Gilray, is a cartoon of Burke pulling the hairs of Pitt and Fox. The Whig party now split into two factions. the other being those who opposed the policy of the government, who became known as Foxites, named after their leader Charles James Fox. Pitt's supporters took the name Pittite after his death in 1806. Lord Liverpool headed up a Pittite administration from 1812 until 1825. It was this administration which became known as Tory, while the opposition were now the Whigs. It continued to enforce repressive measures in the years immediately following the end of hostilities in 1815. According to the historian E.G. Evans, Liverpool's was a thoroughly uncompromisingly Tory administration in its opposition to French principles. His aim was to preserve an old order where property, particularly landed property, and hereditary succession determined the distribution of power. Sorry, too far. Robert Peel entered the cabinet in 1822 as Home Secretary at the age of 34, overseeing the reform of the penal law and the criminal law. In his speech on the 1st of May 1827, following his resignation and refusal to serve under Canning, Peel looked back on his record at the Home Office. I may be a Tory, I may be illiberal, but Tory as I am, I have the further satisfaction of knowing that there is not a single law connected with my name which has not had in its object some mitigation of the severity of the criminal law. He accepted reappointment under Wellington the following year, writing to his wife, "My view is to reunite the old party, which was in existence when Lord Liverpool's calamity befell us." Peel founded the Metropolitan Police in 1829. Hence they became known as Peelers and Bobbies, the latter after his Christian name. He was persuaded of the case for Catholic emancipation after 20 years of staunch opposition to it, having been known as Orange Peel while Chief Secretary for Ireland. He pushed the bill through the House of Commons and lost his seat for the University of Oxford. That is, of course, the door if you come down from the hall coming down from the hall, which everybody's now visiting because of Harry Potter, at Christchurch. You'll see that door as you come out into Tom Quad. So do look out for it next time you come to Oxford. It's one of those students who didn't like Peel's betrayal of Catholic emancipation, as they would have seen it. Peel succeeded to his father's baronetcy in 1830, also taking his father's old constituency of Tamworth. After his party's disastrous defeat in the general election of 1830, Peel became the leader of the opposition in the House of Commons, while Wellington continued to lead the party in the Lords. Having fought hard against the Reform Bill, he accepted pragmatically after its passage into law. He was also willing to support the government in any reform which he deemed to have been justified as a moderate and remedial measure. As Hansard reported on the debate in on the King's speech after the general election of 1832, he was for reforming every institution that really needed reform. He was for doing it gradually, dispassionately, deliberately, in order that reform might be lasting. The scale of the Tory defeat in the general election to the Reformed Parliament of 1832 was unparalleled until the defeat of John Major's government in 1997. Peel could only rely on 179 out of 658 MPs. In November 1834, William IV dismissed Melbourne and his Whig government. Wellington declined the King's invitation to form a minority government. He deferred to Peel, who was on holiday in Rome. Peel accepted the King's commission, but faced a clearly divided party. On the 10th of December 1834, the Times published the first ever party manifesto. In an open letter from Peel to his constituents at Tamworth, the Prime Minister appealed to a broad consensus of moderate opinion within the electorate, while seeking to exploit the weaknesses of the government. It was a bid for the Conservative centre ground. Peel regarded the Reform Act as a final and irrevocable settlement of a great constitutional question. Peel now appealed to moderate men on a platform of what would today be known as consensus politics, and took a conciliatory position. If the spirit of the Reform Bill implies merely a careful review of institutions, civil and ecclesiastical, undertaken in a friendly temper, combining with a firm maintenance of established rights, the correction of approved abuses, and the redress of real grievances, in that case, I can, for myself and my colleagues, undertake to act in such a spirit and with such intentions. The party was renamed the Conservative Party. In the election of 1835, it gained almost 100 seats. In the election that followed the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837, the last time a general election needed to be called on the accession of a new sovereign, Peel was only 20 seats short of an overall majority. The Whigs now relied on the support of Radicals and O'Neill's Irish MPs. In the 1830s, an estimated 58 MPs actually crossed the floor to side with Peel. In 1837, Peel spoke of the difficulty there has frequently been, and you might think this is rather contemporary in some ways, the difficulty there has frequently been of maintaining harmony between the various branches of the Conservative Party, consisting of very different elements that had been in open conflict within a recent period. Sir Robert Peel ably steered a difficult course in these years. Remarkably, there were only 3 occasions between 1835 and 1841 when his backbenchers revolted against Peel, and all 3 related to Ireland. In May 1838, at a banquet held in his honour, Peel told the party, though they were now a great and powerful party, they were still a conservative party, small c. Their function was not to resist, but to preserve. He went on to outline his understanding of what the Conservative Party stood for. By conservative principles, I mean the maintenance of the peerage and the monarchy, the continuance of the just powers and attributes of the King, Lords, and Commons. By conservative principles, I mean that coexistent with equality of civil and rights and privileges, that there shall be an established religion and an imperishable faith, and that established religion shall maintain the doctrines of the Protestant Church. By conservative principles, I mean the maintenance, defense, and continuance of those laws, those institutions, the society and those habits and manners which have contributed to and mold and form the character of Englishmen. In the general election of 1841, Sir Robert Peel's Conservative Party achieved the first ever single party majority in British history. Once in power, Peel disastrously abandoned his efforts to carry the opinion of his party along with him. The historian of the Conservative Party, Robert Blake, concluded, "At a glance, one can see the nature of Tory support. It was overwhelmingly in the counties." The Conservatives had won 124 out of 144 seats in the English counties. They had been won on the issues of the defence of the established church and agricultural protection. On both issues, Peel gave his rebels good grounds for sensing betrayal. In 1845, Peel faced a serious revolt over the grant to the Roman Catholic Seminary at Maynooth in Ireland, first introduced by Pitt 50 years earlier to gain support from the Irish Catholic hierarchy in the war against revolutionary France. It was renewed annually by Parliament. Peel and the Cabinet decided not only to increase it substantially, but to make it permanent and automatic without an annual vote. The issue sparked off a wave of anti-Catholicism. Peel's government introduced income tax, reviving Pitt's wartime expedient of the property tax. Meanwhile, Peel's budgets ended protection in favor of free trade. In reaction, over 100 agricultural protection societies were formed by the mid-1840s. The budget of 1842 introduced ceilings on duties and revised the sliding scale on corn imports downwards. Over the next 3 years, duties were relaxed and abolished on over such a wide range that only the Corn Laws stood in the way of the full commitment to free trade. Their repeal was to bring down the government and irreparably split the Conservative Party, which failed to obtain an overall majority until 1874. The Conservative Party now split into two groups. Edward Stanley was now the acknowledged leader of the Conservative rump. He became the 14th Earl of Derby in 1851. In 1847, these protectionists were led by Benjamin Disraeli in the House of Commons and Derby in the Lords. However, they abandoned protectionism in 1851, and there were no major divisive issues until the death of Palmerston in 1865 reopened the real prospect of parliamentary reform. The supporters of Peel became known as Peelites under the leadership of William Ewart Gladstone. All the major figures in Peel's cabinet now became Peelites, except Stanley. Their numerical strength remains a matter of historical debate. In reality, they were a very loose group who disagreed among themselves on important issues. As one Whig MP commented in 1849, the Peelites are small in numbers and divided among themselves. Gladstone remarked, "We have no party, no organisation, no whipping in." In September 1846, Peel remarked, "I intend to keep aloof from party combinations." In Parliament, he remained a lonely figure until his death in 1850. A modern equivalent might be Ted Heath, or might have been, rather. All the opposition parties, including the Peelites, combined to defeat Disraeli's budget and brought down Derby's first minority government of 1853. When Aberdeen formed his cabinet, he brought in 5 Peelites, 6 Whigs, and 1 Radical. Disraeli referred to them as a band of self-educated geniuses. According to Benjamin Disraeli's biographers, I skipped a page here. Sorry about that. Gladstone turned down an offer of a cabinet post from Derby in 1858. admitting to a strong sense of revulsion from Disraeli personally. The personal animosity between Gladstone and Disraeli prevented any possible rapprochement between these two groups. Gladstone assumed Peel's mantle and never forgave Disraeli for his betrayal. He had contempt for the unscrupulousness and second-handedness of Disraeli. An anti-Tory combination brought down Derby's second government. The Liberal Party grew out of the coalition of Peelites, Whigs, and Radicals in Palmerston's second government of 1859. Clarendon called that administration a great bundle of sticks. The last Conservative minority government, in the last of the Conservative minority governments, Disraeli seized on reform to win over the artisan vote. Lord Derby as Prime Minister and Disraeli as Chancellor saw the sponsorship of reform as an expedient gesture. In November 1866, they persuaded the Cabinet to agree on this. The bill was introduced and underwent many amendments. Each, it seemed, more daring and more radical than the last. Disraeli waved them through, each amendment, in his desire to undermine and infuriate Gladstone. He clothed such changes in the language and tradition of Edmund Burke. In a progressive country, change is constant. And the great question is not whether you should resist change, which is inevitable, but whether that change should be carried out in deference to the manners, customs, laws, the traditions of the people, and in deference to abstract principles and arbitrary and general doctrines. The one is a national system, the other is a philosophic system. The second Reform Act added 1,120,000 voters to the previous 1,400,000, and Disraeli immediately set up a Conservative Party organization to secure votes and allegiance. The myth of Disraeli contains within it a kernel of truth. It runs something like this. Disraeli transformed and saved the Conservative Party through leading it in the direction of social concern and compassion, social reform, to trust the people enough to meet democracy halfway, to appeal to all classes, especially to the deferential Tory working class voter, while preserving the framework of the established constitution and safeguarding national institutions. According to Benjamin Disraeli's first major biographers, Moneypenny and Buckle, even in 1832, all the elements of his finished political creed can already be detected. Disraeli was indebted not only to Burke, but also to Coleridge, and his ideas owed more to the Romantic era, when his views were formed, than to mid or late Victorian era, in which he was in the forefront of party politics. But there's much truth in the verdict of Lady Gwendolen Cecil, Lord Salisbury's daughter and first biographer, who wrote of Disraeli, he saw visions, he did not draw conclusions. Disraeli's only work on political theory, The Vindication of the English Constitution, was published in 1835, when he was only 30 years old and had not yet entered Parliament. It was a two-pronged attack on both utilitarianism and the Whigs. The Tory party was the party of the nation in contrast to the Whigs. National Toryism was rooted in the pride of the English people. Almost 40 years later, Benjamin Disraeli defined the third great object of the Tory party as the maintenance of the institutions of the country. In political institutions are embedded the experience of a race, The continuity of society is through historical tradition, and that tradition is expressed in national institutions, which develop the national character. These institutions are also the guarantors of stability. In upholding those institutions, which give the nation unity and character, the Tory party is justified in claiming to be the national party. Capital N when he refers to national here. The Tory party also stands for the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the established church. The Lords represent the unenfranchised. The church provides a buttressing of authority, encourages the moral code of government and the spiritual basis of society. A national church was essential in providing faith as a sanction of conduct. The Church of England was the great state engine of the Conservative Party. Disraeli appealed to the tradition of Tory paternalism with his profound sense of the organic nature of society. He saw the whole nation as bound together by the web of reciprocal obligations. In this, it is this that makes inequalities bearable and the rule of the elite legitimate. The object of politics is not to foment conflict, but to reconcile classes through genuine sentiments of patriotism, national unity, social and political stability. The Tory party must seek to bridge the chasm which divides the two nations of rich and poor. This was the central message of his most famous novel, Civil or the Two Nations of 1844. He was a novelist before he was a politician, of course, and continued right to the end writing novels. The Tory party must encourage the responsibility of wealth and property towards the less fortunate and introduce social and humanitarian reforms. It must oppose liberal individualism and harsh Benthamite economics, sympathize with the lot of the poor, and provide a cooperative interventionist alternative to self-help liberalism by being concerned for the welfare of the masses. In 1872, Benjamin Disraeli defined the third great object of the Tory party as the elevation of the condition of the people, he tapped into a noble tradition of Tory paternalism, which viewed society as a living and growing organism. The social order centered around mutual obligations and responsibilities. Sovereign and subject, landowner and tenant, parson and parishioner, father and son. In this organic model of society, all its members are dependent upon each other. All had their place in the national order and a role assigned to them. The present and the past formed a unified whole, embodied in the institutions the past generations have bequeathed to the present. As in any living organism, there must be natural growth. The urban poor lived in slums which produced epidemics of cholera and typhoid. Disraeli's Public Health Act of 1875 combined all previous acts into one act, so that local authorities could refer to it as taking action. All local authorities were compelled to employ health and medical inspectors to enforce the act. Another act empowered local authorities to place compulsory purchase orders on any houses unfit for human habitation and build new rentable dwellings. The Climbing Boys Act prohibited the employment of boys as chimney sweeps. Trade unions were now able to strike without being charged with conspiracy and to use peaceful picketing. Employers and workmen were placed on an equal legal footing in cases of breach of contract, which was now reduced from a criminal to a civil offence. His Factory Act finally brought in the maximum 10-hour day and raised the minimum age for part-time employment from 8 to 10 and for full-time employment from 13 to 14. The leader of the Engineers Union, Alexander MacDonald, concluded that the Conservative Party has done more for the working class in 5 years than the Liberals have done in 50. In a speech in Manchester in 1872, Benjamin Disraeli confirmed that England was a great country, an imperial country. And the second great object of the Tory party was to uphold the Empire of England. Therefore, no minister in this country will do his duty who neglects any opportunity of reconstructing as much as possible of our colonial empire. Such an imperial policy required a vigorous and interventionist foreign policy, which Disraeli pursued in government between 1874 and 1880. A cardinal responsibility of British government was to defend the frontiers of British rule in India with land and sea routes from her, especially after Disraeli's acquisition of the Suez Canal. Disraeli's Royal Titles Act made Victoria Empress of India in 1877, with 3/4 of her subjects living in the Indian subcontinent. She had made Disraeli the Earl of Beaconsfield. Punch published the cartoon of them graciously, the 2 cartoons of them graciously exchanging crowns. The death of Disraeli in 1881 left a vacancy in the leadership of the Conservative Party, which was eventually filled by his former Foreign Secretary. Robert Gascoigne Cecil, the 3rd Marquess of Salisbury, had none of his old chief's personal animosity towards his fellow Anglo-Catholic opponent, William Ewart Gladstone. Salisbury was Queen Victoria's last and longest-serving Prime Minister. Much of his energies were focused on foreign affairs, and he remained in his own Foreign Secretary for much of the time that he was Prime Minister. I looked at his foreign policy in an earlier talk, so I won't go back to that now. On the 7th of October 1885, Salisbury delivered his longest speech at Newport, which was dominated by his treatment of the Irish Home Rule question. We look upon the integrity of the empire as a matter more important than almost any other political consideration you can name. And we could not regard with favor any proposal which directly or indirectly menaced that which is the condition of England's position among the nations of the world. To maintain the integrity of the empire must undoubtedly be our first policy with regard to Ireland. Speaking more freely, in May 1886, to the National Union of Conservative Associations, Salisbury stated that he regarded Irish Home Rule as the first step towards the disintegration of the empire. He predicted that self-government would soon be demanded by India and elsewhere, and by races whom he considered were incapable of self-government. Gladstone's Home Rule Bill of 1886 split the Liberal Party. Whigs and Joseph Chamberlain's Liberal Unionists now supported Lord Salisbury's Conservatives as Unionists, the new name used, and for most of the next 2 decades put the Liberals in opposition. Salisbury asserted in 1873 the central doctrine of conservatism, that it is better to endure almost any political evil than risk a breach in the historic continuity of government. Salisbury's clash with Disraeli over the 1867 Reform Act demonstrated his fear of democracy and of the imbalance that would be created in the Constitution through the enfranchisement of the poorer classes. Salisbury showed considerable disquiet over Lord Randolph Churchill's cladding himself in the mantle of Disraeli, portraying himself as Beaconsfield's Elisha, and championing the cause and championing the of Tory democracy, while creating his own fourth party as a thorn in the side of his leader. When Churchill made a display of resigning as Chancellor of the Exchequer in order to get his own way, Salisbury gladly accepted his resignation. Oh, sorry. Lord Salisbury believed that both Christian and Tory doctrine were quite right in asserting a fundamental flaw in human nature. He had a deepening pessimism about the future. Salisbury feared the breakdown of law and order as a consequence of the new anarchist and socialist movements and the more militant trade unionism. Nevertheless, Harold Wilson recalled a conversation with the elderly Clement Attlee. I asked him, parties and politics apart, whom he regarded the best prime minister qua prime minister since he first took off an interest in politics. He had no hesitation. Salisbury. Robert Blake stated that Salisbury was the most formidable intellectual figure that the Conservative Party has ever produced. Thank you very much, everyone.